have ever seen three so ignorant people debating a subject they know nothing about than I saw on this Jacob Rees-Mogg show. Jacob Rees-Mogg was totally sensible in all his points, as you'll see, and I'm going to do a dissection, one of my dissections, on the three ignorant people. And I'm not sparing my words here. I was angry watching it because of that ignorance. People who don't even know what science is or what climate is, which I'll now show you. And yet they're given these positions on major channels. Why GB News didn't have someone on with Jacob Rees-Mogg on this, I'm baffled. Because what he got was three zealots. These are religious zealots as regards climate. They're not sensible. And I'm going to spare no mercy for them as I dissect them in this show. But it starts with a monologue from Jacob, which is perfectly sensible. So I'll let the start go, and then we'll intervene when the zealots join the show.
Climate hysteria has officially reached its peak, and in doing so undermined itself. The United Nations climate chief, Simon Steele, has boldly declared that we have 2 years to save the world. He went on to say,
"Some of you may think the title of today's event is overly dramatic, melodramatic even."
Well, some people would certainly say that, and I'm one of them. But what does Mr. Steele actually have to say to back up these bold claims? First, he makes this claim.
"We are at the start of a race which will determine the biggest winners in a new, clean energy economy. Each country's climate responses will be key to whether they rise up the ladder or fall."
But the markets do not concur with this sentiment. If it makes economic sense to pursue the green agenda, the markets would naturally follow this trend. So why then, and China and India, two of the biggest emitters of carbon dioxide in the world, still burning coal and indeed building more coal power stations? This leads me on to the next point, which is that Mr. Steele talks about global cooperation and coming together. Countries like China aren't interested in coming together for the green agenda. Why? Because it doesn't make economic sense to do so, especially when you still have a partly subsistence economy. Mr. Steele also said this.
For many countries, they will only be able to implement strong new climate plans if we see a quantum leap in climate finance this year.
So he admits that this will cost a fortune, but then goes on to undermine his entire point.
Because it's hard for any government to invest in renewables or climate resilience when Treasury coffers are bare, debt servicing costs have overtaken health spending, new borrowing is impossible, and the wolves of poverty are at the door.
So it's clear that we can't afford it. Then he rather predictably goes on to adopt the socialist language of inequality before saying this.
We need a new deal on climate finance between developed and developing countries. More concessional finance, especially for the poorest and most vulnerable countries.
Well, that translates into saying that he wants you, the British taxpayer, to pay climate reparations, and I can assure him there is no democratic mandate for that in the United Kingdom. But finally, Mr. Steele went on to say this.
At the spring meetings, we need an ambitious round of replenishment for the World Bank's International Development Association, IDA. Doing so could lift hundreds of millions of people out of poverty.
But everyone knows fundamentally that the way the world has lifted millions out of poverty is through the provision of cheap energy. And then there's one way to do that, and that's by boosting supply and bringing to an end the costly green agenda. And now we have the perfect excuse to do that. The world is apparently going to end in 2 years. Well, the UK contributes just 1% of global emissions, and only 2 years before we're all doomed, there's nothing we can do about it. So as it's too late, surely there's no need to try. We should concentrate on what we can do, improving living standards with cheap energy. As ever, let me know your thoughts, monologue@gbnews.com. Well, I'm joined now by three very distinguished men who I think have just about managed not to pass out with irritation at what I've just been saying. They disagree with me very strongly. The environment lawyer and campaigner for Defend Our Juries, Tim Crossland, the chairman of London Climate Change Partnership, Bob Ward, and the Conservative MP, former Conservative MEP, Stanley Johnson. Well, thank you very much for joining me. Tim, it does seem to me that this type of overstatement damages the green agenda. When you say it's 2 years before we're all doomed, makes it very easy for people like me to say, well, if it's 2 years, why are we bothering?
Maybe we should get away from looking to the future and looking at predictions and looking at what's actually happening now. Yesterday, what we heard from farming groups in the UK was that the level of rainfall is damaging our British food security. It's slashing wheat production, putting prices up for consumers. This is happening now. Homeowners in Carlisle now are unable to get insurance for their homes because of the flood risk.
How dare he make such false claims? I'm going to quote from the Carlisle Flood Investigation Report. The city has a long history of flooding, with notable floods in 1771, 1822, 1856, 1925, 1968, and more recently in 2005. That was a 2016 report, by the way. So the floods were far, far worse, as I've been explaining in many videos in the past, as was rainfall far worse then.
How many times they've actually already been flooded. So when you talk about abandoning the green agenda, what you're really talking about is abandoning your constituents who are feeling these impacts right now.
No, it's not, because this is similar levels of rain that we've had in the 1870s, and it similarly wiped out a crop that year. This has happened before. In Somerset, the main reason the levels flooded 10 years ago was because the Environment Agency had stopped the dredging of the drains that had been built in the 18th and 19th century to make the land more productive. It was a deliberately environmental policy that made farming on the levels more difficult.
Jake, what you're advancing there is science. You're not a scientist. You're saying things that are contrary to the scientific consensus.
I'm not challenging the science.
So much ignorance in his response to that question by Jacob Rees-Mogg, which was about the future, because the UN climate chief has just said, we've only got 2 years to save the planet. Well, that's about the future, isn't it? But oh no, he wants to get a message in, and the message demonstrates his ignorance on a number of scales. One, the first one is he then quotes weather about the wet weather, yeah? And then following, that's weather, by the way, not climate. Because you've got to look at weather over a long time to see climate, which I'll do in a second on rainfall. I've actually got a video coming out that goes into detail on the rainfall and the other number of other matters to do with the wet period we're having now. But I'm going to show you some facts, facts. But then Jacob Rees-Mogg responds by making the point that in 1800s there was equal rainfall. He's wrong, because there was more rainfall then. This is the Met Office rainfall record, going back to the 1800s, prior to 1840 even. And there is the highest annual rainfall, way back about 1870. And as you can see, many other rainfalls exceed today's level. The black line is today's level, and the dotted red line is that record back in 1870. But the graph shows more than that. It shows that the range, the difference in the droughts, the low levels like the droughts, and the high levels, the extremes, the extreme weather, was far higher back in the past. But whilst the average rainfall has increased because of the extra 1 degree or so of warming, that is normal and natural, the extremes with it in terms of storms and droughts haven't increased. As I've explained in the video, The Drought That Never Was, the droughts were worst in the past. You can see how dry years are getting less and less, making all this alarm about droughts total fiction. Individual months have no meaning in terms of climate change, but just to make it clear, bringing it into this year, in January, according to the records, the maximum amount of rainfall was around about the 1930 time. Oh, by the way, that was the time of the Great Dust Bowl in America, and by far the hottest temperatures we had in the previous century. So this year we had a very dry January, just as I've shown you. What was February like? Well, it wasn't big at all. In fact, the record was 4 years ago, in January 2020. You see, individual months mean nothing, because if you balance the dry January with wet Februaries or and so on, you have to look at the overall figure. And we don't talk about climate in terms of individual months. But just to carry on the analysis for you. And here we are in March, taking the months of March going back. And again, nothing special at all. In fact, the peak one was in the early 1980s, and there was a similar one in the early 1900s. So individual months are just meaningless. What there is no pact here whatsoever with CO2 or any other greenhouse gas. So far we've shown, one, that this person doesn't understand the difference between weather and climate. Two, he is totally factually wrong in any case, totally factually wrong. But I'm going to repeat what he actually said, because he made two more big mistakes. It's hard to find how much ignorance there is in such a short sentence or two. But let's do a little action replay to remind ourselves what this man said.
Jake, what you're advancing there is science. You're not a scientist. You're saying things that are contrary to the scientific consensus.
I'm not challenging the science.
So now apparently, if you're not a scientist, you can't point out facts. If you're not a doctor, you can't say whether you're male or female, maybe. I mean, that's an absolutely absurd remark. It doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't even matter what your qualifications are. What really matters is what you've said. I mean, fair enough, you shouldn't be lying about your qualifications like Dr. Mann, the hockey stick inventor, if you like, lied about being a Nobel Prize winner. That's wrong, and people faking qualifications is wrong. But it doesn't matter whether you're qualified or not. What matters is the point you're making. What matters is the evidence you bring to the table. And so the arrogance of that coming from someone who is so ignorant. But on top of that, he mentioned the word consensus. You're going against the consensus. So I'm actually going to read something now so you understand consensus fully. And it's not my words. I want to pause here and talk about this notion of consensus and the rise of what is being called consensus science. I regard consensus science as an extremely pernicious development that ought to be stopped cold in its tracks. Historically, the claim of consensus has been the first refuge of scoundrels. It's a way to avoid debate by claiming that the matter's already settled. Whenever you hear the consensus of scientists agrees on something or other, reach for your wallet, because you're being had. And I'll just put my little comment in my own here. That's exactly what the UN are doing, asking for a step-up change in funding, etc., for this madness. I'll continue the quote. Let's be clear, the work of science has nothing whatsoever to do with consensus. Consensus is the business of politics. Science, on the contrary, requires only one investigator who happens to be right, which means that he or she has results that are verifiable by reference to the real world. We've just done that, of course, with those graphs. In science, consensus is irrelevant. What is relevant is reproducible results. The greatest scientists in history are great precisely because they broke with consensus. There is no such thing as consensus science. If it's consensus, it isn't science. And if it's science, it isn't consensus. Period. Michael Crichton. Now, even his own people that he relies on, the IPCC, the Royal Meteorological Society, I'll just quote two of them now, do not claim there's all these extreme weathers. So he's talking about storms and floods, etc. at the moment. So actually, let's just look at that from, first of all, the IPCC, and then the Royal Meteorological Society, and what they have to say. The reference to this is in the description to this video. It's in the latest AR6 IPCC report. So it's the latest big report. And of course it's in with the data, no, not with the political statements by the politicians. So in with this, it says there's no emergence of anything different in the historic record. They can't see anything other than natural to do with mean precipitation, river floods, heavy precipitation and fluvial flood, landslides, aridity, that's droughts, hydrological droughts, agricultural and ecological droughts, and fire weather, that's, by the way, forest fires. So I could go on with a lot more on that. But for the moment, there's no more storms. There's no more. I can show you hurricanes. I could go in tornadoes, anything you like. If anything, they're all reducing. So I disagree with the table there slightly, because nearly all of those things have been reducing in frequency, not staying the same. But the IPCC can't find anything to link climate change because of CO2 with anything to do with the extreme weather, and they're not even saying there's more extreme weather. This is from the Royal Meteorological Society annual report, link in the description. This earlier period before 2000 also included amongst the most severe storms experienced in the UK in observational records, including the Burnsday storm of the 25th of January 1990, the Boxing Day storm of the 26th of December 98, and the Great Storm of the 16th of October 1987. Storm Eunice was the most severe storm to affect England and Wales since February 2014, but even so, these storms of the 1980s and 1990s were very much more severe. So there we are. You have more severe storms, and this in recent past, not going back historically where there were enormous storms, but in recent storms, the 1980s and 1990s were more frequent and more severe. And these are the facts. That doesn't correlate with rising CO2, does it?
I'm just saying these things have happened before. That's not denied by the science.
Not on this scale.
Well, in the UK, the weather has been wet before. We all know that.
The level of impact on crops, not just in the UK but around the world, is unprecedented.
But crops need heat to grow, Bob.
So there you have it again, not on this scale. Nothing like it on this scale. Not true, is it? Just not true. This is pure ignorance. Why are these people on television? Why do we have people who know nothing and spread alarm like this on television?
Well, the Met Office evidence is really clear, Sir Jacob. It is getting rainier in the UK. The level of flooding is more. The last 18 months have been the wettest 18-month period we have ever had on record.
That's a selective.
So it's wrong to claim that we've seen this all before.
How long do the records go back?
That's why your constituents are suffering.
How long do the records go back?
1836.
Okay.
You quoted the 1870s.
I did. That's right.
It
That's right.
wasn't wetter in the 1870s.
No, if you take it for 12 months rather than 18 months.
Well, you can cherry pick whatever you want to do.
I
think your constituents want to hear what you're going to do about it, Sir Jacob.
Most people go for annual
You're just
rainfall.
saying, I don't care about it.
I'm saying have cheap energy.
Why don't you want to do anything about it?
Because we are making the poor in this country and in the world poorer. In the UK, a kilowatt hour of electricity is 44 cents. In the US, it is 17 cents. That is ruining our economy and making my constituents cold and poor.
Well, I don't have to do much about that one. He's just factually wrong. Absolutely factually wrong. But now, in fact, Jacob Rees-Mogg's doing a good job there defending the position. And what they're doing is they're trying to pick out various months and add them together and various things. You've just seen the graphs. You've just seen the truth. But no, the alarmist has to carry on through. And they are just incredible people. So there's another person spouting total ignorant nonsense. And Jacob's doing a decent job. He's trying to point out, no, you've got to go on the annual. You can't just take the odd months and add them together and do various things. That's not the way you do it. You've got the graphs there. You can see it. So what happens now is, of course, he's got to go for a personal attack. So now we have a personal attack, if you like, on Jacob Rees-Mogg, rather than deal with the facts. And so far, they've avoided the first question, which is about where's this 2-year climate emergency? Truth is, they can't justify it. So they haven't even got something to hang on to. They haven't got something to hang on to actually start to justify why we've only got 2 years to save the world. So they've taken it right off subject. This often happens. In fact, it normally happens. And poor old Jacob there is trying to do a good job. But he's got 3 against 1 there. I think this is a totally unbalanced TV session, and I think it's wrong to have these people on.
As you know, Sir Jacob, you spent £78 billion of taxpayers' money bailing out consumers because the price of natural gas went up. £78 billion that went into the pockets of the energy companies. And you clawed back half through the windfall tax. That's not wise use of their money. The people are poor and cold because of your policies.
If we'd done fracking and we'd kept coal and hadn't had this green agenda, we
go back to the 1950s.
I want to pick up on your analysis of the speech. Now, Jacob, I don't think you were very fair. This guy, this man, Mr. Steele, he didn't say the world is going to come to an end.
He did. He said we got his speech here.
No, I'm sorry, I've read the speech word for word. He said that within 2 years we have to get our acts together.
Boris Johnson's dad spots so much rubbish, it's unbelievable. The clear statement at the beginning was UN climate chief says we've only got 2 years to save the world. Now, 2 years to save the world means we must take action within 2 years in order to save the world. And if we don't take those actions, that's it, the world's not saved, it's gone. That is what's being put forward. But oh no, we have to go into the nuances here. Anything to escape the subject. Anyway, I'll let Boris Johnson's dad, seems to be his main qualification for being here, carry on.
Otherwise, we are certainly not going to meet the targets.
He begins.
Note there that he's changed it from, to save the world to, we're not going to meet the targets. This is disingenuous debate. That's a disingenuous point to make.
By the very bit I quoted, saying 2 years to save the world may sound a bit melodramatic.
Well,
and that's why I quoted it.
But you are the one who made it sound, because you say in 2 years the world ends. It may be melodramatic, but it's not the same as saying the world is going to end in 2 years, which is the impression you gave. What I'm saying is he's saying something really, really important. G20 actually are producing still 80% of the world's carbon emissions. G20, the rich countries, including, by the way, India and China.
Yeah, but they're not rich. Not in GDP per capita terms.
No, they are still producing. I'm not here to argue the individual. I'm taking the G20 as a whole, who are on the whole are richer than the people who are not G20 now. Okay.
Well, that's not quite true.
In 2 years' time,
that's not, because
in 2 years'
lots of countries aren't in the G20 who aren't as big as China and India, where the populations are richer. So it's not completely accurate.
In 2 years' time, he is saying, in terms of climate finance, he's saying the next COP meeting at Baku in Azerbaijan has absolutely to concentrate on climate finance. And I think he's right. I think he's right about that.
But that is higher taxes for British people.
Well, we are part of a world.
So you are advocating higher tax for British people?
I am.
Because I'm not. You see, I want tax cuts.
I am one of the people who do believe in the myth. Well, other people think of sustainable growth. I think sustainable growth does work, and sustainable growth actually generates taxes. I did something with Liam Fox, and it was called the case for carbon taxing, the case for carbon pricing. If you have a proper carbon pricing system, you will generate quite a lot of funds, and you'll also deal with climate change.
Wow. So if you introduce new taxes, you get I'll quote, quite a lot of funds. And then you also save the world, you save the climate, you deal with the climate change. So if you keep on taxing people, and already in the UK, we're at highest tax level since the Second World War, that's okay. You keep on taxing people. You know why what's all this is about, this UN stuff and this? It's about the transfer of wealth from Western countries to the less developed countries. At the same time, we're stopping the less developed countries, say in Africa, from using fossil fuels because we won't let the money to develop for fossil fuels, only for sustainable. Just look at what happened in Sri Lanka. That sustainable policy ended up with the overthrow of a government after a famine.
I mean, I think Stanley's made a very important point, that taxes will have to go up in the West to pay for this type of approach that Mr. Steele is advocating. I don't think people in the UK, highest tax rate in 70 years, want to pay higher taxes.
I think the public want to protect themselves. They want to protect the people that they love. And I think we need to be honest. We need to level with the public. It is true that fossil fuels have lifted people out of poverty historically. It is true our economies are highly dependent on them. It is also true that what sustains us is destroying us.
But no, I think your point
we need to be honest about that.
I think your point is fundamental, because I've got the figures here. There were 1.9 billion people in 1990 in absolute poverty. That has gone down to 700 million. It's 35% to 17.1%. This is a phenomenal achievement created by increasing trade and by cheap energy. That has made 1.2 billion people's lives better. There are another 700 million we need to lift out of poverty. That's cheap energy. It's not expensive energy.
But what we're seeing now is that it has done that historically. It is now putting more and more people into poverty. It is about to destroy. We're really interesting.
But where's the evidence for it
fossil
putting
fuel
people into
companies
poverty?
themselves, back in the 80s, said at the rate of climate change that we're seeing now, we will see the end of economic growth in 2025. This was in 1980 because of the impacts that the climate crisis is having.
So next year, economic growth in the world is going to stop because of all these climate problems we've got. Don't look at the facts in this, just look at the hysteria and the political twist that's put on everything. This man is off his trolley with his views. Those views are ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous. We know precisely, and it was predicted in 1980, that by 2025, wow, we're going to start declining. So actually, that's nonsense. And Jacob Rees-Mogg, with cheaper energy and everything, is completely right. And of course, there isn't a climate crisis in any event. And let them define it. They can't. They can't define the crisis.
Well, if I can bring you in, countries with cheaper energy prices are growing faster. And you've seen this, that the US has grown much faster than Europe because it's had fracking and it's had cheaper energy. And this has been really important. Energy costs correlate very strongly with GDP growth and with lifting people out of poverty.
Well, I'm not sure where you've been for the last 2 years, but we've just had a massive cost of living crisis in Britain that was mainly driven by the fact that we're dependent on natural gas, and then that natural gas spiked, and people had to choose between heating or eating. Don't tell me fossil fuels are cheap. They're demonstrably not.
They didn't have that in America because they'd done fracking and they had their own supplies, and we hadn't done it because we're
not the United States. We don't have all that gas. You can frack in your constituents' back garden, see how popular that is. But the point is that when you accuse India and China of not being interested in the green agenda, it's people like you who complain about the fact that China is building so many cheap electric vehicles that they're going to outcompete British manufacturers.
I'm all in favour of them competing. I just don't think the electric vehicles are any good. I want electric vehicles. Stanley, you're an electric vehicle man.
I'm not, actually.
You're not?
Having said that, they do work. I have just, as you know, spent 8 weeks in China, and I've got to say, the revolution which you see there is an energy-based revolution, and part of that is also the electric vehicle.
Still with a lot of coal in China.
China has 1,200 million people, and China has still a per capita income which is way below even the UK's.
Well, thank you very much to Tim, Bob and Stanley. I'm very grateful for them coming in because they probably knew my views before they came. And this is just the sort of discussion we need and like to have. So thank you.
So there we are. That's a wrap for this one. Jacob Rees-Mogg was right all the way through. But to have three people like that on, I don't know what they're doing, GBnews, on this. I mean, why not have some rational debate on there? We had only one rational person in four then, that was Jacob Rees-Mogg. I could have intervened on so many other points, but they're just silly. I mean, the facts are that America has much cheaper power than we have. Why? Because it fracks, and it's as simple as that. In fact, when they, under Trump, when they were fracking at the higher rates, they were bringing the price of oil down worldwide. They were bringing the price of energy down worldwide. Then that's what's needed. And fracking is a very clean system. It's a very small footprint on the countryside and so on. But I know some of you may disagree with that. It doesn't matter. But what you can't not disagree with is the fact, surely, that all this alarmism and 2 years to save the world is total nonsense, and that there is really no cause and effect with CO2 rise and with climate extreme weather, which doesn't exist. Thank you for watching. I do this just to keep my sanity. I really have trouble watching these programs. I watched this one on YouTube and got really upset with it, and so it makes me feel better to do a dissection. I think that's the reason I do it. Thank you for watching. Bye.